A few months after that morning, I found myself sitting in a courtroom in downtown Columbus, listening as my own daughter calmly explained to a judge that I was no longer capable of managing my life. My son sat beside us, nodding along as if the decision had already been made. That hearing began with something small and ordinary, a walk past my son's house and a car in his driveway that should not have been there. My name is Martha Calloway. I had lived in Westerville, Ohio, for most of my adult life. And my routine was simple. Most mornings, I walked through Inniswood Metro Gardens, then took the long way home through a quiet neighborhood street where my son David lived. It was the kind of street where not much ever changed. Lawns were trimmed, mailboxes were straight, and people usually waved when they saw each other. That morning looked the same at first. As I came down the sidewalk toward David's house, I noticed a silver Lexus parked in his driveway. I recognized it immediately. It belonged to my daughter, Sarah. I slowed down without quite meaning to. 2 months earlier, David and Sarah had argued over a failed real estate investment. The conversation had turned ugly. They had both said things people usually regret later. By the end of that evening, they were barely speaking to each other. I remember thinking at the time that they would need months to calm down. So seeing her car there caught my attention. Another detail didn't sit right either. David had told me earlier that morning he would be at a construction site outside Columbus all day. Sarah had mentioned during a call the week before that she would be in Chicago for meetings. Those explanations could not both be true. For a moment, I considered knocking on the door. If they had worked things out, that would have been good news. Families argue sometimes. I had always believed that part would pass. But as I stepped closer to the house, I noticed the kitchen window slightly open. Voices were drifting out into the yard. I heard glasses clink. Then Sarah laughed short and dry. The kind of laugh that tells you you're not in the room, but you're being discussed. I can't explain exactly why. Sometimes you just notice a change in someone you know well. I stepped off the front porch and walked quietly along the side of the house toward the window. Looking back now, I still wonder why I did that. Curiosity? Maybe. Or instinct. At the time, it just felt like the natural thing to do. As I moved closer, the conversation inside became clearer. Papers rustled on the table. I heard a wine bottle being set down. Then Sarah said something that made me stop where I was. Once the doctor confirms Mom's memory is slipping, the court will give us financial guardianship. I stood beside the window, holding the railing with one hand. My fingers tightened without me realizing it. Inside the kitchen, my 2 children sounded relaxed, even cheerful. Outside, I remained very still, listening carefully now, because I had begun to understand that the morning I thought was ordinary was not ordinary at all, and that was the moment when everything started to shift. I stayed beside the kitchen window longer than I expected. At first, I thought I had misunderstood what Sarah meant, but then David spoke again, and the meaning became impossible to ignore. Inside, I heard the sound of a chair sliding across the floor. A bottle touched the counter. David poured more wine and lowered his voice. If the court approves guardianship, we can sell the house within a few months. Sarah turned a page in the folder she had brought. I could hear the paper moving. That's the plan. Mom won't even realize what's happening. David sounded less certain. What if she pushes back? Sarah let out a short laugh. She won't. She's already forgetting things. For a moment, I felt the air leave my chest. Not dramatically, just a quiet, hollow feeling, the kind that makes you pause and steady yourself. I had spent the last few years believing my children were concerned about my health. Now I understood something else had been happening. They had been preparing, Sarah continued, her tone calm and practical. All we need is the medical evaluation and a few months of notes about her confusion. After that, the judge will approve financial guardianship. David lifted his glass. I heard it tap lightly against the counter. To patience, he said. Sarah clinked her glass against his. To the future. That was when I took my phone out of my coat pocket. My hands were not perfectly steady. but they worked well enough. I didn't try to film through the window. I opened the security app and selected the kitchen camera David had installed last year. Just put it under your account, Mom. It's easier, he'd said. I opened the home security app David had asked me to pay for last year. I hit record and let the system capture what it captured. I didn't know yet what a court would allow, but I knew I needed the truth saved somewhere my children couldn't reach. They were being caught by the very technology they thought I was too old to understand. They talked about scheduling an appointment with a doctor. They talked about paperwork. At one point, Sarah mentioned that they should keep acting concerned whenever they saw me. That part stayed with me more than the rest. Then Sarah pushed her chair back. The legs scraped across the floor. That sound was enough to bring me back to my senses. I stopped the recording, slipped the phone into my pocket, and stepped away from the window. I walked down the side path without looking back. I didn't knock on the door. I didn't step inside. Confronting them at that moment would have changed nothing except alerting them that I knew. Instead, I kept walking, past the mailbox, past the corner of the street. Eventually, I reached the park again and stopped near the path where I had started that morning. For a few minutes, I simply stood there. A light breeze moved through the trees. I remember noticing the sound of dry leaves shifting along the pavement, which seemed oddly loud. Then I opened the recording and listened again. Sarah's voice sounded calm, organized, confident. When it finished, I placed the phone back in my pocket and started walking home. Somewhere along that walk, the first clear thought formed in my mind. If my children believed I was already losing control of my life, I realized I might have an advantage they didn't expect, and that idea stayed with me the rest of the way home. That evening, the silence of my Westerville home felt like a warning. I replayed the morning's recording, and suddenly, old moments lined up in my head in a way I couldn't ignore. The questions weren't about me. They were about papers, passwords, and what I owned. I felt disappointed more than angry. I didn't cry. I just got very practical. Instead, I scrolled through my contacts for Daniel Harper, the lawyer who had handled my husband's estate. He was patient, methodical, and above all, loyal. When he answered, my voice didn't waver. "Daniel," I said, "I think my children are planning to take control of my finances. I need to know everything they've been doing behind my back." 2 days later, I sat in Daniel's office near the Scioto Mile. He listened to the recording of my children's laughter and their cold-blooded plan without saying a word. When it finished, he leaned back, his expression grim. "This is preparation for a guardianship petition," he explained. "They'll argue you're mentally incompetent to seize your estate." "Should I confront them?" I asked, my hands tightening on my purse. "No," Daniel said firmly. "If they know you're onto them, they'll just hide their tracks. Right now, they're overconfident." "Let's keep it that way." He paused. "If they think you're slipping, they'll keep writing things down," he said. "Let them, over the next few weeks." I stopped correcting small things in front of them. I let Sarah remind me of appointments. I let David repeat himself, and I kept my own notes quietly. Over the next week, Daniel began reviewing my financial records. I had given him permission to access everything connected to my accounts and legal documents. He worked quietly and methodically, the way people do when they know details matter. A few days later, he called and asked me to come back to his office. When I arrived, he already had several pages printed out on his desk. "I found something you should see," he told me. He turned one of the pages toward me. "This is a login attempt to your online banking account." I looked at the time and date. "I didn't sign in that day," I said. "I know," Daniel replied. "The device used to access it isn't one of yours." He pointed to another line on the page. "The access didn't come from your devices," Daniel said. "And there are signs your tablet may have been compromised." He slid the report closer. "This isn't just family trouble anymore," Daniel said. "Someone tried to get into your accounts. That's serious and it's traceable." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Cars moved slowly along Broad Street below the window. I noticed the sound of traffic more than the view itself. Finally, I asked, "What happens next?" Daniel leaned forward slightly. "They'll file for guardianship eventually," he explained. "And when they do, we'll need proof you're fully capable of managing your own affairs." I nodded. By then, I already understood what that proof would have to be. A few days after our last meeting, Daniel arranged a full cognitive evaluation for me at the Ohio State University Wexner Medical Center. He explained that if my children filed for guardianship, the court would rely heavily on medical evidence. "Think of this as preparation," he told me. "A clear evaluation can end their argument before it really begins." The appointment took place early in the morning. A neurologist led me into a quiet office and began the tests. Some were simple memory exercises. Others involved problem-solving or repeating information after short delays. The entire process lasted close to 2 hours. I answered each question calmly. I didn't rush. I didn't try to prove anything beyond simply being myself. Near the end of the appointment, the doctor reviewed the results on her computer. She turned back toward me and gave a small nod. "Your cognitive function is excellent," she explained. "There are no signs of dementia or impairment." The written report was clear. No sign of cognitive impairment, and no concern about my ability to manage my affairs. I held the document in my hands for a moment before leaving the building. Not because I doubted the result, but because I understood how important that paper might soon become. Later that afternoon, I met Daniel again at his office. He read the report slowly, then placed it back on the desk. "This changes everything," he told me. I leaned back in the chair. "What happens now?" Daniel folded his hands. "Now," he replied quietly, "we wait." "For what?" "For them to make their move." About 2 months after my evaluation, Sarah invited me to dinner at David's house. She called earlier that afternoon and spoke in a careful tone. "Mom, we'd like to talk about a few things. Nothing serious. Just family stuff." When I arrived that evening, both of them were already in the kitchen. The conversation stayed polite through dinner, though the quiet between sentences felt deliberate. After the plates were cleared, Sarah placed a document on the table and slid it toward me. "Mom, we've been worried about you," she explained gently. "You've seemed confused lately." David leaned forward slightly. "This would just let us help with some of the financial things." I looked down at the paper. It was a power of attorney form. Sarah tapped the signature line with the tip of her pen. "This way we can handle bills or decisions if things ever get overwhelming." For a moment, I held the pen and studied the page. I let the silence stretch longer than usual. Then I placed the pen back on the table. I looked at the paper, then at them. "I'm not signing this," I said. Sarah's face tightened. "Mom, it's just in case." "No," I replied. "Not today. Not like this." Sarah tried to hide her disappointment. "David didn't bother." "That seems unnecessary," he muttered. "I'm sure it'll still be here tomorrow," I replied. "Inside my purse." My phone quietly recorded every word of the conversation. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from Franklin County Probate Court. 3 weeks after that dinner, the letter from Franklin County Probate Court arrived. It confirmed what Daniel had expected. Sarah and David had formally petitioned the court to place my finances under guardianship. The hearing took place on a quiet morning in Columbus. Daniel and I arrived early and sat together at the long table near the front of the courtroom. Across from us, Sarah and David were already seated with their attorney. Neither of them looked at me. When the judge entered, the room settled quickly. Their lawyer began first. He explained that my children were concerned about my mental condition. According to the petition, I had become forgetful, confused, and increasingly unable to manage my own finances. Sarah testified before anyone else. Her voice stayed calm and professional. "My mother has repeated conversations lately," she explained. "She sometimes forgets what day it is. We're worried she might make financial decisions that could harm her long-term security." David followed. He confirmed her version without adding much. "We only want to protect her," he said. Their attorney then turned toward the judge. "Given the circumstances, guardianship would allow these children to responsibly manage their mother's assets." Daniel waited until the judge nodded for our side to respond. He stood and placed a folder on the table. "Your Honor, we'd like to begin with a medical evaluation conducted at the Ohio State University Wexner Medical Center." The judge reviewed the report for several moments. "This evaluation states Mrs. Calloway shows no signs of cognitive impairment," the judge noted. Daniel continued calmly. "There's also evidence someone attempted to access Mrs. Calloway's financial accounts without authorization." He handed over the login records Daniel had discovered earlier. The courtroom remained quiet. Then Daniel asked the judge for permission to play an audio recording. When the judge agreed, Daniel pressed a button. Sarah's voice filled the room. "Once we've got a doctor to write it down, the judge will sign off. Then we're in control." The sound carried clearly across the courtroom. A few people in the gallery shifted in their seats. The judge looked directly at Sarah. "Ms. Calloway," the judge began slowly, "are you aware that this recording suggests a plan to exploit your mother financially?" Sarah's expression changed immediately. David lowered his eyes and stared at the table. The judge called a short recess before returning with a decision. The guardianship petition was denied. The judge referred the unauthorized account access issue for further investigation. Daniel closed his folder quietly. Across the room, my children remained seated, suddenly very still. The hearing ended there, but the silence between us had already begun to grow. The weeks after the hearing were quieter than I expected. At first, there was no contact from either of my children. No calls, no messages. The silence settled in slowly, and I allowed it to stay that way. Daniel checked in with me once or twice to confirm there were no new filings from their attorney. About 2 weeks later, he called again with different news. "I thought you should know something." He told me over the phone, "Your son's investment project is collapsing." I asked him what he meant. Daniel explained that David had put money into a housing development outside Columbus. David had sunk money into a housing development outside Columbus, Daniel said, and he'd been planning to cover the shortfall with money he expected to get his hands on your assets. Daniel paused. "Without that, the lender is calling in what they can. He was counting on selling your property to cover a large portion of the debt," Daniel added. "Without that money, the lender is demanding repayment." I sat quietly while he finished explaining. "And Sarah?" I asked. Daniel hesitated briefly before answering. "Her firm opened an internal review after the hearing." Daniel said, "She was placed on leave while they looked into it." He paused. "Even before any conclusion, people notice, and they remember." After that call, the house felt unusually still. I moved through my normal routine, cooking dinner, watering the plants in the kitchen window, paying bills the way I always had. Neither David nor Sarah reached out. For a while, I wondered if they might eventually try. But as the days passed, I began to understand something that had not been clear to me before. Some decisions leave no path back. Nearly a year after the hearing, I sold the house in Westerville. Daniel handled the paperwork. When the closing finished, he shook my hand and gave a small nod. "You protected yourself," he told me. "Not everyone manages to do that." "I had help," I replied. A few months later, I moved to Hilton Head, South Carolina. The change felt quiet rather than dramatic. Most mornings I walk for a while before breakfast. In the afternoons, I volunteer with a small nonprofit that helps older adults who have been pressured or misled about money by people close to them. One afternoon, a woman about my age sat across the table from me during a meeting and admitted, "I kept thinking my son wouldn't really do that to me." I understood the feeling. Sometimes the hardest lesson isn't about money at all. It's learning that love doesn't always prevent someone from making selfish choices. And protecting yourself doesn't mean you stopped caring. It just means you finally accepted what someone else was willing to do. Later that evening, I opened a drawer and found an old photograph of David and Sarah as children, standing in the backyard and laughing. I looked at it for a long time before closing the drawer again. I don't hate them. I just don't trust them with access to my life anymore. David lost his project, and Sarah lost her reputation, but they lost something much more valuable. A mother who would have left them everything. If you discovered your children were plotting to take your life's work while you were still breathing, would you forgive them? Or would you move 1,000 miles away? Let me know in the comments.